So it is now 10:30. I think we can start with our webinar also because I'm going to start with a couple of useful information for those of you who have just joined us for the first time. Before that, we have today a special guest with us, who's Orsola Lamberti, whom I thank you very, very much for being here with us today and keeping on a nice tradition of cooperation among the European IP Helpdesk and the CPVO. Thank you, Ursula, and a very good morning for being with us today.
Thank you.
Then secondly, for you participants, thanks a lot also for having chosen to spend this hour and 15 minutes together for a new thematic that we're going to cover, which is the relationship between geographical indication, trademarks, and plant variety denominations. For those of you who have not used GoToWebinar yet, so it's the first time, you might have noticed that your is switched off, so you cannot talk directly to us. And that is because we are a lot of participants at the moment, and if you would be able to talk or make background noises, it would be pretty much impossible for us to carry out the presentation and give you information, basically. So that does not mean that you're not welcome to ask questions. You should do that, and please just write them in the question area of your screen on the right-hand side or in the chat. I will collect all the questions and we're going to answer them later on throughout the presentation. The presentation is today divided in two parts, except for the services of the European IP Helpdesk that I will show you in a couple of minutes. I will start by stealing a little bit of time to Orsola in order to resume and repeat a couple of information regarding trademarks and geographical indications. For those of you who were present throughout this year regularly to our webinars, you might have known already that we had two webinars regarding trademarks and geographical indication, and they were available as well in the registration page of the webinar today. But in order to cover all the thematics, I will start with that, and then I will leave the word to Orsola that will go more in depth regarding plant variety denomination and conflicts and synergies between the three rights. Now, let me start quickly by introducing you the services of the European IP Helpdesk. Maybe you know that already following our webinar, but we are an initiative of the European Commission that has the objective of supporting small and medium enterprises and researchers in getting on well and coping with intellectual property and intellectual property rights. So what we do is divided in a number of services that consist of publications that are online on our website, available for you and for your use. We have ambassadors around Europe that might be in your state or around you that can help you getting in touch with us or translating our document in your own language, for example. We've got trainings that are on-site and online, like today, and I'm going to show you the new webinar plan for January and onwards in 2020. And finally, we have a helpline service, which is probably the most interesting and useful service, because through our helpline, you can ask questions directly to our experts sitting in Alicante that are going to answer you within 3 working days in the most easy and understandable way possible. This is a little bit what you can find within our website. If you register to our website, you will receive once every 2 weeks a newsletter that is resuming and gathering all the information regarding the help desk, for example, when are going webinar to take place and so on. And you will also be submitted to receive the bulletin once every 6 months, which is also an interesting document to read, for example, if you're in travel and so on. Those are the upcoming webinars for next year. we're going to have a break, luckily for Christmas, but then already on the 15th of January, we're going to be back. So we hope we'll have the chance to meet all of you there in the next year. One last information regarding the other help desks that are active around Europe that can help you gathering information regarding intellectual property outside the European Union. They are here. So the IPR-SME Helpdesk China, IPR-SME Helpdesk Southeast Asia, IPR-SME Helpdesk Latin America, in case you should need support for activities that are outside the European continent. Finally, you can see on the right-hand side the IP Booster, which is a very interesting tool that has been developed also by the European Commission in order to help universities and research centers to better exploit the results that they might have between your hands and at least their hands and at least understand how valuable the result of the R&D activities and development is. And with that, I will start the real content of today's presentation, which is a guide to geographical indication and plant variety denomination. Do you want to say something, Orsola?
Yeah, I have the presentation, so you should give me the rights to display the presentation.
Okay. There we go.
Okay. Okay.
Now you should share your screen. Is
okay.
Correct?
Not this part of my screen, maybe. Okay. Perfect.
There you go.
Okay, I'm almost there. Here you go. Does it work?
Perfect.
Okay.
It does work. Now, do not move your mouse or your keyboard because I think
I may have to give more control, right?
Yes, to me, so that I can move the slides.
Okay. That's done, right? Yeah.
Yes, I think so. All right, excuse me for the small break, but we had to change the slide. So there we go. Why did we choose to carry out this webinar today at A Guide to Geographical Indication, Trademarks and Plant Variety Denomination? Well, from my point of view is that because we've covered singularly all of those topics within 3 different webinars throughout the year. And I saw from the questions that we have received from participants, but also from small and medium enterprises and researchers, that those 3 webinars actually they defined and try to clear what those 3 intellectual property rights are and how to register them and so on, but it wasn't clear where one of them is ending and when the other is actually beginning, and what is the relationship among them, and how to deal with protection that can cover a multiple aspect of a product, or for trademarks also a service. So that is why we have decided to propose this new webinar and all these slides, I would say 90% of the slides have been created from Orsola. That is why she was so keen on showing the right ones, and I thank you very much for this. But we will go through then all the different rights and their characteristic once again, trying to have a general idea of how they can be beside one another and how they can coexist in a interesting way for business. Now, first of all, an introduction. Every day we have to deal with science, and that we want it or not, we have to take a look at the world around us, and being have to deal with what signs are actually showing us, and how we can get on with this information that we receive through visual normally impact. So this has also to do with trademarks, that's also to do with geographical indication, that's also to do with plant variety denomination, because here we are talking about signs that are used, for example, in the market to guide the consumer, signs that are used to guide commerciants, and so on. So it is signs we are talking about today. But those signs provide actually different information. For example, in the first Coca-Cola can, you can see that the information there provided are about the entrepreneur, about the company that is behind that product, that good that we can see there. The second, instead, you see the information provided by the sign is actually about the product itself that is commercialized. And with the third, instead, the information that is provided is about the variety that we are talking about. Those are signs, are visual inputs to the person's eye that provide, in their way, different information that might be useful for different actors in the market in order to provide useful information, so to say. But it's signs that we are talking about. As you can see here, there are things in common between those three rights, those three rights, and they are used to identify goods normally, or services in case of trademarks, and we're going to see that later on in the slides. They are used to identify them on a marketplace because they are normally in the market, and they are used to identify products within the market, and through them, through this sign, we are actually providing information about the goods, either about characteristic of the product itself, but also sometimes characteristic of the entrepreneur as well. It depends on the sign that we are talking about. And therefore, we influence, or I'd say facilitate, like you can read here, the purchase choices of the consumers. Because we are in a competitive environment, and those signs are useful to take advantage of the good qualities of the products that we may offer within the market. There are differences, however, generally among the three rights, which are, of course, the information provided. So the kind of information that is provided, we have seen it before with the first example as well, with a can of Coca-Cola is providing actually an information regarding the entrepreneur, whilst the cheese instead is providing a information regarding the good itself. The functions that they have are also different. We use the Coca-Cola can and the Coca-Cola sign to guide the consumer among the different inputs that he might receive, for example, in a supermarket, whilst we guided the information of, we use the information of the Manchego cheese to state that there is a certain quality of the product within that particular cheese. The holder of the title is also something different. It changes from title from sign to sign, from right to right, and also the scope of the protection is not the same, and we're going to see that later on. Of course, each and every one of them has a different legislation, and they are aimed also at a different public, in the sense that if we have a trademark, for example, again, the Coca-Cola can, before we're actually aiming at consumer, but the tulip instead that we have seen as a plant variety denomination on the third image is actually aimed at commercial operators and not really to consumers themselves. So there are are differences, and I just resumed them very quickly here in these slides, between those three rights, between those three signs as well. And the trick today is to try to see how these differences may come together and how we can take advantage of the common features that we have seen in the slides before this one. There we go. That is what I wanted to say. I had to change the slide before. So you can see up in the left-hand side, the potential points in common, whilst on the right-hand side, the potential fights and things that might be incompatible among them. Now let's start then with a separate assessment of those three rights, starting by the trademark. So now we're going to talk about the first of the three. So please remember just the Coca-Cola can that we have seen before. Trademarks are signs that are used within the market to distinguish goods and or services offered by one undertaking from those or from those of other undertakings in the marketplace. What does that mean? That means that a trademark might be an image, might be a writing, might be also sound, might be different kind of signs, audiovisual, visual, or audio as well, that is used to distinguish a certain product or services within the market. And by that, I mean to provide the information of the entrepreneur to the consumers that are going to buy the product. You can see here there are different kinds. There might be a logo, there might be a writing trademarks, and however, what is peculiar of them is that they directly give to the consumer information regarding the owner of that trademark. So the entrepreneur that is behind the services or the products that are produced under that particular trademark. That's why the primary function is to indicate the commercial origins and of the goods or the services. This way, consumers may identify goods and or services that are originating from that specific undertaking. And it allows companies to differentiate their product from those of their competitors within the market. I usually give an example to explain why and how trademarks are useful. Just think about getting inside a supermarket with all the products that are white, so you cannot really differentiate any of them. You would need a couple of hours perhaps just to find the soap that you like to buy or that you bought last week that worked so well, but you cannot find it anymore because you cannot differentiate one product among the other. And that is very bad also for competition as well, because if I am the entrepreneur that produced that very good soap that you wanted to buy again, but you cannot find anymore, I'm going to be penalized because despite the good quality of my product, your choice is probably going to be only random regarding how much time you have to buy your product and what is the nearest to your hand when you're going to buy it. So that is the main reason why we've got trademarks, in order to guide consumers, which, allow me this, are pretty much like sheeps when they enter the supermarket, to be able to buy the products that they want based on their previous experience, based on how the trademark sometimes also looks like and if they like it, and so on. And that are therefore the function of the qualities. So quality, goodwill, and advertisement. The quality, because we're trying to look for certain characteristic of our products within a certain trademark that was produced, that is produced by a certain entrepreneur. The goodwill as well, because the entrepreneur is actually putting this goods and services at the disposal of the consumer, and so that they can find it again, so to say, and be able to buy it again. And then as advertisement, as I was telling you, if the trademark is also appealing, then perhaps some of the consumers might be moved to buy that trademark because simply to buy the product because of simply of the appeal that the trademark is giving to that product. The feature of technical of the trademark are that it is a intellectual property right that needs to be registered in order to receive protection. So you need to register your trademark, and you can do it at a national, European, or also international level. It is an exclusive right, meaning that the owner may prevent others from using that particular logo that he registered, that particular writing that he read, his trademark. He can prevent others from the use of that trademark within the market for certain products and services for which he has applied for protection. The time, also the third characteristic of the product, is very interesting as well, because the protection lasts 20 years. Excuse me, that's very wrong. The protection is potentially without any kind of limit, as long as you renew your trademark. That's why, for example, the Coca-Cola trademark is lasting or now from more than 90 years as well. As long as you renew your trademark and you pay your fees, you do not have any kind of limits. I said 20 years, for example, because that is instead the limit that you might have with patents, and therefore after 20 years you may not renew your patent anymore. But for trademarks that is not the case. They are granted within a limited territory, and that is why I told you before that the trademark, you may choose to register your trademark within a national territory, so a national trademark and patent office, or also at the European Union Intellectual Property Office in Alicante to receive protection all around Europe. Whilst you may also choose the WIPO to address different territory around the world and be able to file all around the world. Licensing is, I would say, the most beloved exploitation measure that you might have in order to take out worth of your trademark. Licensing means that this exclusive right that you have of excluding other from using your trademark is actually it is the key to enter to this monopoly that you have. So you grant a license to a third party so that they might access to the use of the trademark in, for example, a certain territory or for a certain amount of time. So that in exchange, of course, of money normally or other goods and services. Just for your information, Orsola has inserted also the trademark legal framework, and you can see at the national level, and we have also the Directive 2015 2436, which is a directive. Therefore, it is a obligations for the member states to adapt their internal laws to the directive of the European Commission. And then we have the European Union Trademark Regulation 2017-1001, which is a regulation harmonized at the European level. So first of all, we covered now a small resume of the trademarks, the main characteristics. Now, the geographical indications, what they are. Geographical indications are signs to use to identify a good that is originating from a specific geographical region. So, and there we have a specific quality, reputation, or other characteristic of the goods that essentially are may be attributed to the region where they originate. So we have here in this feature the intersection between the area where this product originates, the characteristic of the product itself, and the link between the area and the product. So here we are, instead of focusing on the entrepreneur like we did for the trademark, we're actually focusing on the good and where that good is originating from. In fact, the function of geographical indication is to state the geographical origin of those goods, and most importantly, the quality and the authenticity of the product, depending on the different geographical indication. But through this, we can directly or indirectly safeguard the biodiversity and the traditional knowledge. Why? Because also the development of rural areas. Why? Because we are this way giving an added value to a certain territory that normally is rural, that normally is not industrially developed, because let's say it's based on a certain way of tradition and living. And this way, so practically this territory has a economical advantage in the form of a certain geographical indication, recognition of qualities and originality of goods that are coming from this particular area. And that, in theory, may directly or indirectly generate social cohesion in the sense that, for example, if a good might be sold twice as much, well, if a good may be sold a little bit more expensive to the consumer because of the certification of its characteristic, because of the certification of the ingredients, for example, then also different jobs might be generated around this industry there. And that brings young people, instead of moving away from the rural area, perhaps to stay there and generate social cohesion as well. But now let's go to the technical characteristic of GIs. Here as well, we have the registration, but the registration is a little bit different than the one that we have for trademarks. We're going to see that later on. And we have here a collective right. So we do not have a entrepreneur that is owning directly the trademark, but their trademark is actually belonging to the territory and the community where the products are originating from. These GI is actually giving us information regarding the product, so product specification. It is very important because we're not focusing, again, I'm telling you again, we're not focusing on the entrepreneur here like with the trademark, but we are focusing on the product itself. And it is granted as well for a limited territory, and here as well it is potentially unlimited in time, as long as the characteristic within that territory that makes that product so special keep on being the one that generate the characteristic of that product. Here we have a little bit more developed legal framework because we have different regulation depending on the product that we have under under our scope. So the regulation 1151/2002 for agricultural products and foodstuff, 1308/2013 for wines, and so on for spirit drinks and aromatized wines. So just take a look to those regulations if you have interest in those kind of products and see how they are regulated. Excuse me. Now, let's see, however, because within the geographical indication, we have a triple choice, so to say, to go through. So when the link between the product qualities and the characteristic of geographical origin exists and meet the quality scheme, the name of such product can be registered and protected as EU geographical indication. But you can see there are here 3 signs that we have under our view, and usually we can see also in the supermarket. And if you try to try to ask to consumers, they have normally no clue about what they mean. So just to make a small resume and see what they are and what they do. First of all, that can you see the? Okay, you can see the slide. Okay, so depending on, of course, on the product we have and the characteristic that it has, we have a different logo that characterizes the product. We have the denomination of origin that it identifies a specific place, region, or country. What is particular regarding this is that all the production steps, and you can see here, and all the raw materials in order to create that particular good are produced in a particular region. Whilst in the second case, geographical indication of origin, there is a specific place, region, or country, and here we have the difference that at least one ingredient within the production step is proceeding from these particular regions, but the raw material are actually coming from everywhere, might be coming from everywhere. Instead, the traditional specialty guaranteed is different from the geographical indication itself and from the protected designation of origin, because actually production step raw material may be done anywhere. The point is that here a traditional receipt or a traditional method for production are followed. So when you see those signs now, please just contextualize them and see where they belong to in order to have more characteristic regarding the products that you're buying or that you would like to buy. This was, for me, the small resume of the first two rights. I will now give the word back again to Orsola. You should have. Okay. Now.
Can I? Hello, I cannot hear you. Okay.
That is fine, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I'm just starting. So the third right we will talk about today, better said, the third denomination wording that we're talking about today is plant variety denomination. Here in my slide, you can see a lot of acronyms: PVD, PV, PVRs. I really invite you to stay, to give me a little bit of attention, because in the first place, they look a little bit mysterious, but if we have a couple of concepts very clear from the beginning, it's really easier to understand what's the difference among plant variety, a plant variety right, and a plant variety denomination. What's important for our relationship with trademarks and geographical indication is not the plant variety right, nor the plant variety, but the plant variety denomination. But we have to start from the plant variety. So what's a plant variety? A PV. It's a precisely defined group of plants selected from a species and with a common set of characteristics. Now, in other presentations, I used the legal basis of our basic regulation, Regulation 2100 from 1994, Article 5, and it's a very long definition. It's not clear at all, so please consider that these definitions are not a copy-paste from the law, but they are simplified, and when I say simplified, I mean simplified for a lawyer, so for a person like me who doesn't have a really technical background. So it's a precisely defined group of plants. What does it mean? It means that there is a science called taxonomy that I discovered a few years ago, that is the science to classify plants on the basis of their phenotype. So what's a phenotype? Basically, what we see in plants, what we see from the outside, is the result of three elements. One is the genotype, one is our epigenetic factors, and the third element is the environment. What does it mean? That if a certain plant or a certain organism in general, that includes humans and animals, not only plants, looks in a certain way, it depends, first of all, from the genotype, the DNA, what kind of genes, the gene set that we have inside of every single cell of our body. Then we have the epigenetic factors, which are the characteristics that are not necessarily shown in our phenotype, so but that come from the characteristic of our parents or parental lines if we're talking about plants. And the third element is the environment. The environment is can of course affect and have an influence on how we look and how plants look, of course. So how do we classify plants? On the basis of how they look like. Is an apple red? We don't care about in general terms, in principle, we don't care about the genotype, how the gene set look like, but what we can see from the outside. So saying that we define plant varieties on the basis of how they look like, we can see how plant variety is the most concrete and specific way that we can use to describe a plant material. In other words, I put you here an example. We talk about taxonomy again, this science that classifies everything, every living organism, and it goes from oh, I cannot use my pointer. Yes, I can. We have very big categories and that go in a more specific way to smaller categories. The biggest categories that we have in taxonomy is the kingdom. The kingdom that is of our interest in this case is of course the kingdom of plants. The other ones that you may know is the kingdom of animal, of which we're part, and the other are more about bacteria and amoebas. We do not talk about them. I'm not saying that they're not important, they're fundamental for our life on the planet, but they're not important today. So on the basis of how a plant looks like, we can classify it in these smaller and smaller categories. Here we have plants, then we have angiosperms, then we have rosales, then we have the family Rosacea, and then in the end we have the species and the genus and the species. I put you here a more visual example of the very same classification. First, we have in the plant kingdom, of course, we have this family, Rosacea, which includes about 91 general flowering plants. It's a very, very big category in which we can identify the genus or genera, if it's plural, Malus. The genus Malus includes about 55 species of trees and shrubs, so it's not only big trees that we used to see, but also bushes. And in this genus we have the species Malus domestica, is the apple that we know and we see every day. In this particular categorization, I put you just the outline of apple, because Malus domestica, the combination of the genus and the species, indicates an apple in general, but we are well aware of the fact that apples come in all shapes and colors, and we can see it, for instance, here in the species apple, Malus domestica, we have about 7,500 varieties of apples. Among these, we have, for instance, Crips Pink. We will talk about Crips Pink later. It's basically the pink lady. It's a very well-known plant variety that you may have seen at the supermarket. So this is what a plant variety is. Just the description of this plant material. But in the very big category of plant varieties, we have to distinguish between non-protected varieties and protected varieties. Indeed, before I show you these very nice acronyms, PV is a plant variety, PVR is a plant variety, right? Well, it's possible, of course, to protect a plant variety through an intellectual property right. In the same way as we have machines not protected by a patent and machines which are new and groundbreaking, which are protected indeed by a patent, we have the same scheme, let's say, applied to plant varieties. Indeed, as you can see here, the definition of plant variety is wider than the definition of protected variety and does not require that all the conditions for the grant of a plant variety right shall be fully met. In other words, plant variety is just a way to classify a certain plant material, but if you really have the desire, the need to protect your plant variety, well, then it must be your plant variety has to comply with certain requirements indicated by the basic regulation, the regulation that we mentioned before, 2100 from 1994. What are the registration requirements? I'm not going to go into details because these are, we could talk an entire day about the DUS requirement, distinctness, uniformity, and stability. Let's just say that these are technical requirements that say that basically the plant variety that you created is does not look like the ones that already exist, and it displays more or less the same characteristics. The novelty is a commercial novelty, so it means that the plant variety shouldn't have been put on the market at the date of application. And finally, the variety denomination. Finally, what we're trying to talk about today together with trademarks and geographical indication. So the variety denomination is not a right per se. I will repeat this again and again because it's very important. It's not part of the scope of the right, of the IP right, but it's a requirement for registration. You have created an amazing variety of corn, which gives a tremendous yield, and you want to register it through a plant variety right, you can do it. But you have to remember that your variety of corn must comply with these three technical requirements. It has to be novel, and it needs to have a name, a generic name, a variety denomination. Once all these requirements are complied with, then it's possible to have your IP protection. And that's the moment where we go to the PVD definition, the plant variety denomination, as a generic designation of a protected plant variety, which enables the variety to be identified on the market. This is a very important characteristic. We will see it later. As a matter of fact, the plant variety denomination must not mislead or cause confusion concerning the characteristics, value, or identity of the variety. There are more grounds for refusal of a plant variety denominations, which are contained in Article 63 of our regulation, the basic regulation, but we will not go into details. In any case, if you're a trademark examiner or you have familiarity with trademark law, you can see some similarity with the absolute grounds for refusal of trademarks. What's important is that our variety denomination is a way through which we are able to identify on the market the plant material. Before, when we were talking about apples and we saw some pictures, I told you that, of course, as you know, apples come in all shapes and colors, and some of them are very nice, some of them are less nice, it depends on your taste. But how can you identify that the plant material on the market? How can you know that this this delicious and green and very crispy apple is exactly the same? Well, you use the plant variety denomination, which in our example is Granny Smith. In other words, once that we saw this very specific apple on the market with these characteristics, which are part of an internationally recognized protocol, we know that that name is Granny Smith, and if we have to purchase again as a professional the propagating material of that plant variety, we know how to address the distributors, how to find the plant material that we really need. Now, I use the example of the Granny Smith because it was the first example that I really understood from the beginning. This is a very particular plant material fruit. It's very characteristic, so you can remember even as a general consumer who does not have any knowledge in agronomic knowledge, you can understand what are the characteristics of this plant material. However, what happened when we are talking about cherry tomatoes? This is just to let you understand what is the main public the plant variety denomination is targeting. Because before, with geographical indication and trademarks, we talked about general consumers. Actually, for trademarks, for some goods and services, it can be a professional consumer. We will talk about that in a minute. What I would like you to notice is that as a general consumer, so as a lawyer, for instance, I know that my cherry tomatoes are those little very sweet tomatoes that I find at the supermarket, and for me, these three cherry tomatoes are exactly the same thing. However, here you can see consumers identify the variety under as cherry. You will go to the supermarket and you will say, I really want a very sweet salad. I want my cherry tomato, and that's what I'm looking for. However, this plant material has very different characteristics in the eyes of a professional, which means there is when I'm talking about professionals, I'm talking about growers, the people who are actually growing maybe in a greenhouse, maybe in an open field. It depends on the plant variety. These plant varieties, so to put them after and distribute them on the market. In this case, for instance, you can see a slight difference, but as a general consumer here, between cherry sweetie and cherry buzz, or I think that I got part of this denomination, I cannot see any difference. But the difference in this case could be, for instance, and this is very common in tomatoes, the resistance to a certain pest, a certain disease, or a certain growing condition. This is not known to the final consumer. Is not known by me, the lawyer who goes to the supermarket and looks for a nice tomato for her salad. But this is very well known to growers and people who have to distribute these plant varieties in a certain region. So even if this characteristic is not known to the consumers, it's very important, because it means that if a certain tomato has a resistance to a pest or a growing condition in a certain region, it means that that certain region can have access, for instance, to cherry tomato, and can have access to this good for a fair price, because there is no need to import or export, etc. But how the final consumer can recognize the cherry tomatoes that they like because of the taste in this case? Well, in this case, we will have to use the other signs that we saw before, so the trademarks, like you can see in this case. So essential function, as I mentioned before, the function of a plant variety denomination, why the plant variety creator, the breeder, needs to give this generic name to the office, is that we really have the need to identify on the market this plant material, and in the eyes of, first of all, professionals. Now, once again, we saw the cherry tomatoes before, we saw the Granny Smith before. They have very clear characteristics, but you also have to think about agricultural species, fodder, or wheat. I mean, to me, they all look the same, and sometimes to examiners too. So it's really essential to have a generic name. It can be a code or a fancy name. It doesn't have to be appealing or anything, but you need to call it in a certain way, so that when you go to the market and you have this brown bag of seeds, for instance, or propagating material, you're sure that what you're going to grow in your field as a distributor has certain characteristics, and maybe the resistance to a certain pest, etc. However, here I added a little caveat. So we said that it's plant variety denomination is useful to identify the plant material on the market for professionals. However, in some little cases, we can see that it's directed to final consumers. We will see an example later with tulips, and for instance, for private garden varieties. The feature of a plant variety denomination, I will never repeat this enough, is not an IP right. The IP right is the plant variety right, so the protection on the new, distinct, stable and homogeneous plant variety. But the right of the breeder, which is the holder of the right in this case, is not on the denomination. So there is no exclusive right on the denomination. In other words, the breeder does not have the right to prevent anyone from using the plant variety denomination. It's quite the contrary, actually, because in case of plant variety denominations, we have an obligation to use. What does it mean? It means that it doesn't matter whether the plant variety is protected or not protected. There is an obligation for everyone that is commercializing the plant variety on the European market, at least, to use that plant variety denominations. There is plenty of non-protected varieties, traditional varieties that are 50 years old. There is no breeder and there is no exclusive right on the plant. However, there is still an obligation to use that very same name. An example, I think, is Fuji. The apple Fuji, it's a red and yellow apple that you may know, is not protected by a plant variety. However, if a distributor wants to put that specific apple on the market and wants to grow it, it's necessary, and wants to sell it, the propagating material, it's necessary, is an obligation to use the Fuji denomination. As we said before, it's a plant variety denomination is a registration requirement. It's not part of the IP rights, and it's the generic name of the plant variety. This word generic is essential because it will make us understand better why a registered plant variety denomination is an absolute ground for refusal for trademarks in the same class, in the class 31 agricultural product. An example. So when do you have to use the plant variety denomination? In principle, you're supposed to use the plant variety denomination, in this case, on the propagating material. What is this thing? It's actually a planting for a grapevine variety, in this case, early sweet. It's put on the market like this, and it's given to growers and producers. In principle, again, there is no need to use the plant variety denomination on the harvested material, so on the grape, unless, according to the cascade principle, which is a little bit more advanced and not the object of this presentation, the breeder did not have the opportunity to exercise his rights in another way. But for your knowledge, for your basic knowledge, the plant variety denomination is used on this propagating material. Why? Because it's used for professionals, for the ones who it does not target the final consumer of the grape. Another example, pasta. What's the difference here? So when are we using the plant variety denomination? I'm sure that from my previous example you already know, but it's very important to understand the difference among propagating material, harvested material, and product directly obtained from the plant variety. In this first case, as propagating material, we have the seeds or the grains of wheat, which are used to propagate, of course, the plant material. In this case, who is gonna sell the propagating material has the obligation to use the plant variety denomination. So if our wheat variety is called Michele, it's absolutely compulsory when selling the brown bag containing the seeds to the producers who's going to grow his wheat in his field to use the plant variety denomination Michele. On harvested material, in principle, we will say that it's not necessary to use the plant variety denomination, and it's absolutely not necessary to use the plant variety denomination when we have a product obtained from their wheat, in this case, pasta. You're never going to see a plant. I'm not going to say never going to see because there are some specific cases, but in principle, it's very difficult to see a plant variety denomination of a strawberry, for instance, on the packaging of the jam produced from the same strawberry. This doesn't happen with wines, but in general, it's not used like that. Why? Once again, because the plant variety denomination targets only professional consumers, not the final consumer. This is the legal framework for the protection of plant variety denomination. Well, this is actually the legal framework referring only to plant variety rights, because for the interface of plant variety denomination with other rights, we will mention other pieces of legislation. But just for you to know, for plant variety rights, so IP rights on the new plant varieties, we have the EUIPHD Convention. The EUIPHD Convention is very similar to the TRIPS agreement and is the equivalent of the WIPO in referring to patents and trademarks and geographical indication. It's the convention on which the protection of plant variety is based. It's a very simple text, a very ancient text, and it's the basis of first of all, our basic regulation that I mentioned a couple of times during this presentation is the Bible of Plant Variety Protection in the European Union, and this is the number. Then we have of course, the European Union member states legislations, and then we also have the extra European Union legislations, which are also relevant for the EUIPHD Convention. So they reflect, usually they reflect the EUIPHD Convention. So this is the legal framework. And I know that the plant variety denomination explanation was a little bit long, but it's very important that you have all the examples and the differences clear, so that when we go to this comparative assessment, we're able to grasp it in few seconds. So first of all, where is the IP rights? Now, you should give me this answer very easily if you were paying attention to Michele and me, but I will mention it again. In the trademark, the IP right is embedded in the sign. In our example, Coca-Cola, assuming that Coca-Cola was registered in that way, the protection, so the possibility for the owner to exclude other people from using the sign is referred to this red circle, the word Coca-Cola, in this particular font. Imagining that the trademark was registered as a word trademark, so only the word Coca-Cola, then the IP rights would be embedded in the sign, no matter the logo, no matter the font, no matter the figurative, let's say, representation of this word. And the geographical indication, the IP right is also in the sign. This is very small, but this sign says aceto balsamico di Modena, which is a special kind of vineyard from Michele's region, actually, Emilia-Romagna, and it's very good. And so the IP rights, the possibility to exclude the others from using this sign is in the sign again. So nobody who does, so people who don't comply, producers who don't comply with the specification of the aceto balsamico di Modena cannot rightfully use this sign. Where is the IP right in plant variety denomination? It's not in the plant variety denomination. It's actually in the plant variety right. So the IP right is on the propagating material. In our example, crisp pink, in the propagating material, so not in the apple in principle, but in the plantling of the apple of this particular plant variety. Who uses the sign? For trademarks, who has when we say who uses the sign, we want to know actually who cannot use the sign, right? So this happens in trademarks, for instance. A trademark is an exclusive right, which means that that particular logo or that particular word can be used only by the trademark holder and by third parties when there is consent of the owner. Michele before mentioned licensing. This is a typical instrument that is used to give permissions to others to use a registered logo or unregistered, because there are also some trademarks which are protected despite being unregistered. So through licensing, it's possible to give permission to other people, to other undertakings, to use that particular logo for a certain period of time for certain goods and services. And exclusive rights means that if there is no permission, it's possible for the trademark holder to prevent others from using his logo. How? Through an infringement action before usually national courts. For geographical indication, it's a little bit different. Before we said that it's a collective right. How does it work for geographical indication? Basically, there is not one person who holds the right, but usually we have a consortium of producers who decide to ask to the Commission. This is a very non-technical, but so the consortium asks to the Commission to recognize their geographical indication. They draft what we call a product specification. The product specification is a very important document because it's part of the scope of the right in geographical indication. It's a document where it says in order to use this specific geographical indication, the product has to be produced in this way, in this region, through this method, etc. So the consortium drafts this product specification, and then the Commission may accept to grant this geographical indication. At that point, there is no actual exclusive right, in the sense that once a producer complies with the product specification, which means that he produces a certain cheese in a certain region through a certain method, there is no way the consortium or anyone can prevent that producer to use the geographical indication. As per plant variety denomination, as we saw before, anyone commercializing the plant variety has the obligation. So in the first place, we have an exclusive right. Second place, we have a collective right. And this is not, once again, for plant variety denomination is not a right, is an obligation. If you're selling the plant variety, you need to use it. The products. In trademarks, as you may know, the object of a trademark can be any good or any service. They are classified in 45 classes. This is called the NICE classification. It's also very nice, and basically it comprises all the possible goods and services. Why is that important? Because it's important because it's a part of the scope of protection of the trademark, but it's also useful to identify the relevant consumer in the case of trademarks. In other words, many goods are directed to general consumers, to final consumers, like Michele mentioned before, for Coca-Cola or for clothing in general. But trademarks can also be targeting a very high-skilled and high professional in no matter what industry. As per GIs, what's the product on which we can find a GI? We have agricultural products. I put you here an example, which is the limone di Sorrento. If you arrived to this presentation through LinkedIn, you may have seen some questions on the limone di Sorrento. Just a couple of words on this. The fact that we have a geographical indication regarding this agricultural product means that some lemons produced in the region of Sorrento, which is a city close to Naples, in a certain way have the possibility to use this wording. This is different from a protected plant variety, because a plant variety is usually Plant variety right is protecting innovation, so a new plant variety, while in this case, the geographical indication on the Limone di Sorrento is protecting the tradition, so a certain way to cultivate, to grow these lemons coming from this region. GIs also protect foodstuff, like in the case of Havarti cheese that comes from Denmark, and also refer to wines and spirits, like in the case of Champagne. In the case of Champagne, this is a geographical protected denomination. It's very important to remember that, as Michele mentioned before, and this means that the connection between the region and the product is really strict. You can produce champagne only in the region of Champagne. There is no way you can get the grapes from another region. This is because it's written in the product specification, and if you don't comply with the product specification, you cannot use the wording on your labeling. And plant variety denominations are used on every kind of plant material, agricultural crops like cereals, fodders, fruit and vegetables, and ornamentals. Other considerations on this comparative assessment is that all this wording, all these signs, I would say, I don't want to say right because plant variety denomination is not right, are potentially unlimited, have a potentially unlimited duration. As Michele mentioned before, trademarks can be renewed every 10 years. Geographical indications also do not have a specific duration, and the obligation to use the plant variety denomination keeps being valid also after the expiration of the right on the plant variety. Consumers, once again, consumers are very different. In trademarks, they can be final consumers or professionals. In GIs, they're usually what we call the informed consumer, which means that it's a consumer who knows a little bit about the quality of or why a certain product coming from a region has a certain quality, etc. We have the right versus obligation. We saw that before, and this is a generalization a little bit, but we have the emotional versus the rational choice. We saw that we have all different kinds of consumers also in the same sign. But just an example is that what's the emotional choice? The one that we saw, that we can see, for instance, in the use of trademarks. There is imagine that there is an advertisement campaign that creates a lot of hype, and consumer goes to the supermarket or to a certain store and buys a certain product because it has that hype, not only for the quality, so not only because the consumer tried that before, but also because there is also this the dream sold, for instance, by luxury goods brands. And then we have the rational choice. An example is the choice made by the grower when it picks a certain plant variety using the denomination to identify it because that tomato is resistant to a pest affecting the region he's working in. Conflict. Do I have time? How much time I have for this? Because sometimes
I would go on. I would complete the webinar. Don't worry about the time.
Great. Okay. So bear with me just for a little while. I'll try to be simple and clear. So the first conflict I would like to talk to you about is the conflict between plant variety denominations and geographical indication. At the CPVO here, at the Community Plant Variety Office, we have an entire team dedicated to the check of the suitability of plant variety denomination. On the basis of this fantastic article, which is Article 63 of our basic regulation. And one of the checks that is done, together with the fact that the plant variety denomination is not misleading or descriptive or doesn't go against public order, etc., is whether there is a geographical indication. We have to make a difference between geographical names and geographical indications. If you're familiar with trademarks, you already know this difference. a geographical name, it means simply like in this in the case of Castilla, it means that it refers to a city or a region. While in the geographical indication there is an actual right on that geographical wording. In the case of geographical name, like in the example of Castilla for a pepper variety, we have to consider whether the region of Castilla-León traditionally cultivates pepper. The proposal will not be suitable if the variety does not originate from the region. It's a little bit on the other way around when you consider the absolute grounds for refusal for descriptive character of trademarks. In this case, we have to know whether Castilla-León is considered is well known for peppers. In this case, the candidate variety, and in case that pepper, that is the candidate variety, does not come from the region of Castilla-León, it will not be possible to use that denomination. This is the and this is a different ground from refusal when it comes to the reference to geographical indication, because in the first case we have some kind of descriptive character ground for refusal, while in the second case we have a refusal based on the existence of a previous right. So a plant variety denomination in principle cannot be accepted when there is a previous right existing. This is referred to geographical indications and trademarks too. This is, in case you were wondering where to look for the information on geographical indications, so what do we use as examiners here at the CPVO, but also at in trademark offices? This is the DOR database. It's the database of the European Commission that contains all the geographical indication on foodstuff. The Commission actually provides 3 different databases. It's either on foodstuff and traditional specialties guaranteed. We have Ibacus on wine, and we have his spirit for spirit drinks. I will leave you, I think that you will receive the presentation after, and you will see that in the comments of the presentation you have the links to these databases. So you have to use this page. It's very clear, and you can also find the product specification of every single geographical indication to know how they are produced and what's the method chosen. Plant variety denominations and trademarks. We have to distinguish whether we are looking at this issue from the denomination team of the CPVO or the operation department of the EUIPHD, because in case there is a prior trademark and during the registration procedure of a plant variety, we will use Article 63 again of the basic regulation, and as we saw before, it's not possible to accept a plant variety denomination when there is a third person's right which is already registered. In other words, a plant variety denomination cannot be registered when there is a trademark which is still in force. And when we look at the issue from the perspective of the trademark examiner, we will apply Article 7.1m of the European Union Trademark Regulation, the regulation that we saw before when we mentioned legal basis referring to trademarks. In this case, it's not possible, sorry. Okay, what does the Article 7.1m says? That it's not possible to register a trademark that consists or reproduces in its essential element the earlier denomination of a plant variety right registered at the national, EU, or EUPHD level. EUPHD means international level, as we saw before, concerning the same species or closely related species. The application of this article is quite complex because we do not have a lot of case law, and we base ourselves in a few judgments. And my advice, if you want to know more, is to check the EUIPHD guidelines on the application of 7.1m, and in particular this decision of this judgment of the General Court. I'll just go here very quickly in case you don't know where to look for a registered trademark. You can use eSearch Plus. I will also include the link to this page. And where do you find plant variety denominations? You have to register on Variety Finder. This is the screenshot that I used to explain how to use the database in case of absolute grounds for refusal of trademarks. So what are the fields that we have to select when we are wondering whether we can register a trademark being in place a plant variety denomination. So basically when we are a trademark examiner who doesn't know whether there is a absolute grounds for refusal based on 71M. This is just a summary of what's of what we saw before. So what are the criteria to use on our variety finder? Conflicts between GIs and trademarks. The first scenario is when we have a prior GI and a later trademark. In this case, we will apply Article 71J of the European Union Trademark Regulation, and we apply the principle of priority. The prior GI, which is the right that prevails in this conflict, can be registered at either a EU or a national level, and it can be either absolute or relative ground for refusal. So absolute means that is the examiner who is studying the application of the trademark that has to raise an objection, and in the second case also it's possible for the consortium, for instance, or to raise silent opposition proceeding against the registration of the trademark. Trademarks versus geographical indication. In this case, we have a prior trademark and the later GI. Actually, this is an example of the applicable legislation, because this is only referred to foodstuff. This is the regulation of foodstuff, geographical indication on foodstuff. And in this case, we have the principle of coexistence. So a GI, in principle, may contain the name may contain a registered trademark unless there is bad faith and unless it's a well-known trademark. So in case you were wondering, it's not possible to include in your application for registration of a GI the word Coca-Cola, for instance, or Apple. That's a particular case. So synergies. These are just examples of how these rights are used in combination with each other. So geographical indication, trademarks, and plant variety denominations are not only being in conflict among each other, but they can also be part of a broader business strategy and be used together. We see some example. One is the wine labeling. Here it's a very clear example because we have the trademark, Viña Gourmand, and then we have the variety denomination. This is the name of the grape variety used to produce this wine, and then we have Ribera del Duero, which tells us what kind of wine we are drinking, what kind of wine we're purchasing, and we can have an indication on the flavor and the quality of it. As I told you before, wine labeling is one of those cases where you can see the use of variety denomination also refer to final consumers. Another example is the Zespri kiwi. I don't know whether you can see it very well on this slide. In any case, here we can see very clearly that we have a mother trademark, which is Zespri, the name of the company, and then we have the two trademarks used to indicate the green kiwis and the yellow kiwis. These are not the plant variety denominations. So this is how it's the plant variety denomination is used in general when they are registered here at the CPVO. Actually, these are registered varieties, and their plant variety denomination is just a code. So it's not so directed to final consumers because producers, the grower, do not need an appealing name as Sun Gold, for instance, like in this case. A very well-known example is the Pink Lady trademark. Actually, I thought before working at the CPVO, I thought that the Pink Lady was one specific kind of apple. I thought that it was very clear to me what was its flavor, color, and characteristics. Turns out that Pink Lady is a trademark that is used for 3 different mutations of the Golden Delicious apple. These 3 mutations are Rosy Glow, Sexy, and Crisp Pink that we saw in our example before. The trademark is, of course, this one. This is the number, and it's registered in class 31 for agricultural products. Another last example of synergy. These are 2 pictures that I took a couple of weeks ago at Amsterdam airport, and it's also one of the examples where not only these different rights are used together, but they also target an unusual consumer. Here we see, apart from the representation of the product, here we have the trademark. So the trademark is the name of the undertaking, which is here. Then we have the indication of the product. This is the common name of the plant variety that we are selling. In our previous example, it was Malus domestica, apple in general. And here, in very tiny, we have the plant variety denomination. So here we have Prince Parrot, and here we have Queen of Night. As a final consumer, I may not even read what's the name, but this is just to make you clear that tulips come from the same undertaking, have different characteristics. In this case, they are more, it's more pinkish, and in this other case, it's actually purple-blue. I think that I overdid with the saturation modification. And in any case, the plant variety denomination is a way to distinguish these very clearly distinct plant varieties on the market. And conclusions, maybe Michele, you want to go for that?
Yeah, I can take the word very, very quickly because we want to leave also a couple of minutes for the questions. So you can already think about your questions if you have a couple and write them in the question part of the screen right hand side. So just to go a little bit for the conclusions, and thank you, Orsola, for the presentation. So it was very interesting for me to hear it. And I saw that I made a couple of mistakes. For example, right. I have been using the word right a little bit too much at the beginning, but it was very interesting for me as well to have you and explain why plant varieties denomination may not be considered a right, since I'm not an expert of that. I've learned something as well today. But so we have seen the different functions that those signs might have, either in the view of the entrepreneur from one side, or the product, or also from the view of the consumers. Might be the general consumer that enters supermarket, it might be the consumer a little bit more informed, or it might be also a professional that is interested in the very characteristic of the product. We have seen that within a package of a product there might be some hidden information that we actually didn't have no clue were there, because sometimes we stop to the very first information. For example, tulips are tulips and I buy them for the colors that I see, but there are also others information written there that are given by one of the 3 features that we have described today. Of course, they have a different purpose, and I hope that we could explain what purpose they have in the view of the different consumers, in the view of the owners of their rights, and that is because they have, as I said, a different public. And the IP right is protected when there is directly or indirectly, and most importantly, I would say they might be combined, as we saw for the kiwi. It was very interesting to see that we might have combined geographical indication, or for the wine, the Tempranillo wine, we might have combined geographical indication, we might have combined signs that add characteristic to different to the same product, and therefore may ensure a certain kind of market advantage for the entrepreneur, for the consortium that is using those information in the most efficient way. And I see there are already questions, so I'm glad that you could already write down a couple of questions while I was making up the conclusion. So the first question, then I'm going to write the answer down, is from Christos. Can a protected plant variety, for example, a local variety of apples registered in the common catalog, be also registered as a PDO, PGI product?
Okay. If you remember I hope you can hear me. If you remember the example of the Limone di Sorrento, actually these two rights have a completely different functions. In other terms, you may not, if you register a plant variety with a plant variety right, it means that that plant variety is an innovation, has a new characteristic, a new resistance, a very productive yield, or a specific color. So it's new, you never put it on the market. So so you have an IP right saying, look, this is characteristic, this is a new plant variety, enhanced, it's better from the others because it's new. On the other side, you have the geographical indication, which is a right that protects tradition. We saw before traditional knowledge, biodiversity, the support to rural communities. So it means that if the geographical indication refers to an agricultural product, like the lemon from Sorrento, it means that you're protecting the tradition, something that has been done in a certain way for decades. So it's a completely different kind of right.
Thank you.
Principle, they should not overlap.
Yeah. So there we go. I think you can see my screen now. Can you?
Yeah, more or less.
So I'm going to read it to you anyway. It's so that also the participants can see the questions as well. So the question is, can I name my sunflower Coca or Champagne or Queen of the Night or Orsola as well? That's a question from Philippe. I think it's, you know him.
No.
Okay.
Okay. So the answer to this is it depends. So in the case of Coca, well, I think you meant Coca-Cola, right? So Coca-Cola is a registered trademark. As we saw before, it's not possible to accept a variety denomination that entails a prior right. So there is a registered trademark. In principle, you should not put it in a plant variety denomination. We had that case with Red Bull. The Red Bull was not happy to see a plant variety named after their trademark. As for Champagne, in the case, no, Champagne is a geographical indication. Champagne, sorry, why are you writing Champagne TM?
Because there was a correction. Yeah, Philippe wrote Champagne TM, not Champagne, sorry.
Okay. We have to notice that if Champagne is, in principle, Champagne cannot be a trademark because it's a geographical indication. There is a protection with a protected denomination of origin, which is referred to Champagne for wine, actually for sparkling wine. So it means that no trademark referring to wines and sparkling wines can contain the denomination, the wording Champagne. A plant variety denomination cannot, of course, consist of a geographical indication as a trademark for the same reason that we saw before, because it's not possible to use a wording that is already protected by another right, in this case, geographical indication. Queen of Knight is actually a very nice example of variety denomination. It's perfectly fine to use it. It's a fancy name. It does not describe any characteristic. It may be allusive to the fact that it's in the case that we saw before, a tulip which has a dark purple and blue shade, but it does not really describe nor mislead or does not incur in any ground of refusal that I can think of. And Orsola Lamberti, yeah, if I don't complain about that, they can. I mean, it depends on a plant variety. I'd be happy to see it on a tulip, but if it's a shrub or fodder, I don't know. But in principle, yeah, yes, you can.
Very good. Very, very good. Also, I'd like to have my name on a.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something on the first question, unless the
Yeah, please.
possible, because in the first question you mentioned the national catalog. It's very important to understand the difference between protected and non-protected plant varieties, but the fact that a plant variety is not protected, it does not mean that it's not in any register. It's in fact, in order to be commercialized in the European Union, a plant variety needs to be put on a specific register. It depends on the crop, so if it's an ornamental fruit, etc. But in principle, we can say that if you want to put a plant variety on the market, it doesn't a new one, an old one, a traditional one, it needs to be in the common catalog in the national listing. So this is very different from plant variety protection.
Great. One other question that you can see here that was asked, when will we receive today's slide? I'm going to take care of this one because it's more administrative. So you're going to receive the slide as soon as possible, ideally this afternoon, because after that I'm going to be on holiday, so it's going to be also hard to send them to you. So you will receive them this afternoon, and also the recording of the webinar. But we have another technical question here, and it is my understanding that CPVO does not allow denomination identical to trademarks. What about similar PV, plant variety denomination, to registered trademarks? Is it compulsory to notify the trademark holder in case of similarities? Should I write it? Perhaps it's a little bit long.
No, it's okay. There is no. It's in general we consider there is up to the trademark holder to file an objection. It's actually the proceedings is very similar. If you're familiar with oppositions against the registration of trademarks, it's exactly the same. We have the publication of the denomination, not the publication of the application of registration. And once the denomination is published, it's possible, there are 3 months for other parties, interested parties, to file an objection. We don't call it opposition, but it's very similar to an opposition. And one of the grounds may be risk of confusion, so no likelihood of confusion with a trademark, but that's up to the trademark holder.
I see. Other questions? It seems like we have no other questions. I don't see also in the chat part. So with this, I would thank you all for having been here with us today, a little bit further than our usual time, but I think it was time well spent because the information were correct, accurate, and most of all useful. There are a couple of thank you very much for you, Orsola, because people were very happy about the presentation. I'm very glad that also I had the chance to follow it. And from me as well, of course, a very big thank you for creating this webinar today and for keeping on the relationship between the CPVO and the European IP Helpdesk that we hope next year can perhaps go on, but we still have our recording as remember in case it shouldn't happen. Then I thank you then everybody, and since that's the last webinar of the year, I wish you a very nice Christmas and a very happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye. How do I do this?